Services librarian here at Simsbury Public Library. Welcome to Fostering Change. This is the first in a three-part series with Rabbi Gavi, Ruit. We're going to be talking about the highlights of Jewish history tonight, and parts 2 and 3 are coming up in April and May, so look for those on our event calendar. Just a couple library things to get out of the way. If you could fill out program evaluations tonight after we're done here. I set them up over there. They're usually on this side, but they're on that countertop with some pencils. It's how we evaluate programs and whether we have programs come back to the library. So if you could do that tonight, I would appreciate it very much. And now I'm going to introduce another rabbi from the Farmington Valley Jewish Congregation. Here is Rabbi Becca Goldman to say an opening blessing.
Hey y'all, how's it going? I'm gonna set my paper down here. When I said to Sin, I'm happy to do some sort of opening blessing for this, she was like, neutral space, no praying. Wait, I said a prayer, an opening prayer. She was like, neutral space, no praying. I was like, don't worry. I was just offer something simple and sweet. So it's so great to see y'all this evening. And I will say that after you leave tonight, I have a feeling you are going to be on the phone with your friends, encouraging them to come with you for the next session, because Rabbi Gavi is amazing and has so much to teach us and offer us. So, and I'm going to apologize because I have to leave for another meeting. But I did want to offer this opening blessing, and I want to give a little bit of intro. So we all go through our lives engaged in our work, in our play, in various states of intentionality or mindfulness. And one of the things that I love about Judaism is that it demands of me constant mindfulness. Woke up this morning, there's a blessing for that. Saw a rainbow, there's a blessing for that. Enjoyed an amazing meal, there's a blessing for that. Went to the bathroom, there's a blessing for that, right? There is a blessing for everything. In fact, Talmud, I'm sure Rabbi Gabi will go over this a little bit, which is the rabbinic sort of compendium of lore and legend composed between 200 and 500 Common Era. Or evolving. Right? Not a historian. Okay. So the Talmud teaches that it is forbidden to derive benefit from this amazing world without reciting a blessing. So to fail to bless is tantamount to stealing, right? And knowing the blessing you ought to say upon any given situation or circumstance prepares us to acknowledge that the world and everything within it and all of our experiences within it, they are amazing gifts from the divine, right? However you conceive of that. So we have lots of interreligious and interfaith community events in this magnificently mixed town, which I'm so grateful for. And I always think it's essential to acknowledge the importance of these opportunities. But when I went searching for some sort of blessing to speak to the holiness of this work, this interreligious community dialogue and learning, I encountered a little bit of a problem. There's no blessing for this. I was right. There's a blessing for everything in Judaism. There's no blessing for this. Since I spent much of my time involved with intentional interfaith dialogue, I felt that there should be a specific blessing for this type of endeavor, especially since I believe that this work is crucial in creating an open, honest space where we can ask questions of each other, where we can learn from each other, where we can dialogue in a safe way that brings us closer together, and it enhances all of our lives. So at the heart of interfaith engagement is our need for one another, which I really love, because here we are as a community coming together to learn with each other. And when we encounter the other, we learn things we couldn't have known had we stayed isolated. We accomplish what is otherwise impossible without collaboration. We grow in ways that we couldn't have grown by ourselves. And ultimately, we can bless in each other what lacks in ourselves, because that is precisely what brings us together, seeking meaning and depth from each other. So I have this little blessing here. It's not one of the official ones. So it's going to be a little different. And I wrote it in English, so bear with me. Blessed is God who creates us varied and many, needing one another. Blessed are our traditions, varied and many, requiring each other. Blessed is our time together. May it provide nourishment for us and for the world. And I'm going to say amen because I think it was an awesome blessing. So I am excited that we're all learning together, and I'm so grateful that Rabbi Gavi is teaching this awesome class, and I look forward to seeing y'all at some of the other ones. Thank y'all.
Thank you, Rabbi Becca Goldman. Okay, so let me share a few words about our presenter for this evening. Rabbi Gavi Ruit was ordained by Hebrew Union College, Los Angeles, and did post-ordination graduate work in medieval and modern Jewish thought at HUC Cincinnati. Her approach to the rabbinate is both scholarly and deeply spiritual. Prior to entering the rabbinate, Rabbi Ruit worked as a developmental specialist with troubled children and teens, and that psychology background continues to add aid to her in her rabbinate. She is currently the director of the Lifelong Learning at FVJC, and please join me in welcoming Rabbi Gavi Ruit.
Thank you so much. I think that's going to be passed up. Wonderful. Thank you. Stay out of that. First off, since I am notoriously poor with microphones, I want to make sure everyone can hear me. Yes? Okay, awesome. So the session today is about the highlights of Jewish history, from medieval time through modernity. And in reality, a class like that could easily take full semesters. So we are going to get just a little taste today. And in setting up a class like this, there needs to be an organizing principle, because since I'm just taking little pieces of history to sort of highlight the arc of Jewish history. Now, typically that organizing principle is very lacrimonious. It's usually you see classes such as this where we basically go through all the bad things that happened to Jews from the Middle Ages to modernity, and that's the class. I'm not a big fan of that organizing principle, because while a lot of bad things did happen to Jews over the centuries, a lot of wonderful innovations occurred as well. And so the organizing principle for this class is how a people in exile maintain their identity. Because that's really what Jews have done. From prior to the Middle Ages, Jews were in exile, and we'll get into the reasons for that in just a minute. But they no longer were able to be in their homelands. They lived under many different cultures, many different ruling rulers that had religion as their dominant focus. So Jews lived primarily under Christian and Muslim rule from the Middle Ages up until the Enlightenment. And so the first big question is, why did the Jews go into exile? Why would a people who were quite content in their homeland need to leave? And there are three big reasons, three big events that set the stage for this exodus of Jews from the land of Israel. The first was the destruction of the Second Temple. Now, for those of you who don't know, prior to the destruction of the Second Temple, Judaism was largely a sacrificial cult. That's the terminology that is used, because the ways that Jews worshipped were to bring animals to the priesthood, give their animals to the priest sacrificed them. There was a sort of a letting
loose of holiness through that process. Now, while all of that was going on, there were the beginnings of what we know to be Judaism today. The Pharisees, who were proto-rabbis, they were sort of the precursor to the rabbis of the rabbinic age. They were starting to build up momentum even when the Second Temple existed. But we had sort of two parallel ways of practicing Judaism. One was the sacrificial cult, which is what is outlined in Torah, and therefore a very important part of Jewish history. And then we had a much more democratized approach to holiness that the rabbis would go on to develop, in which our behavior gave us access to holiness, as opposed to having lambs or goats or all the other doves being sacrificed. But in the 70 CE, the Romans sacked the temple. It was completely destroyed. Now, at that point, Jews had not exited yet. The reasons for that sacking are deep and many, and not the focus of this discussion today. But let's just say, as a cliff note, Jews were very unhappy living under Roman rule, and were often engaged in sort of revolts to push against their Roman overseers. Romans, not too thrilled with that. They did not like being resisted, and it culminated in the destruction of the temple. So that was the first big thing. The epicenter of Jewish practice was destroyed. That was incredibly demoralizing for the people, and it also made the reason why Jerusalem was the epicenter of Jewish life to have less force, because Jerusalem is where the temple was. People went to sacrifice to the temple. The temple was now destroyed. So our next big reason for making the homeland inhospitable for Jews was the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that happened in 135 CE. And Bar Kokhba was doing what folks in 70 were doing. They were resisting Roman rule. They were resisting having their lives dominated, directed, and overseen by a people other than themselves. And so Bar Kokhba started to rebel. And he was seen as a possible messiah by some of the leading rabbis of the day. Bar Kokhba failed in his revolt. He was killed. And the Roman response was so intense that not only where initially only the temple was sacked, at this point, the Romans went in and completely destroyed Jerusalem. They dispersed salt into the farmland, and they prohibited any Jews from being in Jerusalem. So that's a major discomfort when you've got the greatest congregation of Jews in the land of Israel were in and around Jerusalem, and now they are no longer allowed to be there. So that was the second reason why that set the stage for the exodus of Jews from the land of Israel. The third is Constantine. And I see Constantine as the origin story for all anti-Semitism, because Constantine made religion political. And he did that by he was a general. He went on to become the emperor of Rome at the time. And his mother, who had secretly converted to Christianity about 30 years before, she did so in secret, because she would have been executed had anyone known. That's how Christianity was viewed at that time. But with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, and most importantly, making Rome a Christian nation, which it had not been up until then. And up until then, it had been a pagan nation, which had a certain degree of tolerance for a whole variety of religions, because every people had one. Rome becomes a Christian nation, and now Jews who had been living a reasonable existence even after the Bar Kokhba debacle are now being executed in really horrific ways. Scholars are being burned at the stake and flayed and all sorts of really gruesome things, because Judaism now became the enemy of Rome, because Rome was Christian. And for the Christians of the time, now you have to remember, Christianity is an offshoot of Judaism, began as an offshoot of Judaism. And as is always the case with siblings, there was tension. And there was tension between Judaism and Christianity because they both wanted to see themselves as the ultimate Israelites, that are seen in the Bible. But with Constantine converting, it now becomes this very dangerous and inhospitable place. So the Jews of this time emigrated from the land of Israel for the same reason that refugees all emigrate from their lands, because it wasn't safe where they were and they needed to leave. So that sets the stage for what is the meat and potatoes of this kosher meat and potatoes of this class. So that is not the one. There's not what I'm looking for. There we go. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about is how Jews maintain their identity. And when they were living under Christian rule or under Muslim rule, and again, we're jumping, because this class is about the Middle Ages to modernity, we are jumping into the Middle Ages now. I just wanted to let y'all know why that emigration needed to happen. So Jews found themselves in the position of being in unknown lands where they were not autonomous, but under both Christian and Muslim rule in the early Middle Ages. It changes dramatically later on, but in the early Middle Ages, Jews were allowed a reasonable amount of autonomy within whatever country they were in, and went about forming Jewish communities. So one of the ways that Jews maintained Jewish identity in this very difficult time and place was concentrating on community. And the very first three things that any Jewish collective needed to do when setting up a new little town, a new little shtetl, was setting aside the land for cemetery, building a mikveh. For those of you who don't know, mikveh is a ritual bath that Jews take a dip in for any number of reasons. But the most consistent reason throughout history was within the Tanakh, and then later within the Hebrew Bible, and then later in the Talmud. Laws are developed for women in terms of ritual purity and having to do with their menstruation cycle. So post-menstruation, in order to have sexual relations with their husbands, they needed to go to the mikveh first. So we've got cemetery, mikveh, and then forming a cheder, or a schoolhouse, literally a schoolroom. Cheder is schoolroom. But these were the three primary values that Jews across the world carried with them, that providing for the education of children and the ability to cohabitate with your beloved, and a safe and dignified place to have your final resting place. These were the values that the Jews throughout the world used in developing their first communities outside of the land of Israel. I wanted to share this Talmud text because it gives a great insight into how Jews saw living in community. So it says here that a Talmud Chacham is not allowed to live in a city that does not have these 10 things. A Beit Din, a law court that metes out punishments. A tzedakah fund that is collected. Tzedakah is charity for those in need. A tzedakah fund that is collected by 2 people and distributed by 3. A synagogue, a mikveh, a bathroom. That seems very practical. A doctor, a craftsman, a bloodletter, a butcher, and a teacher of children. So this is from Tractate Sanhedrin. But it gives a really good idea of the type of communities that Jews across the world saw as important in establishing, which is they established communities that met the needs of all within the community. Children were taught, people were fed, cohabitation occurs because a mikveh is in business. And again, we're seeing sort of the underlying values here that kept the Jewish identity together. If anybody has any questions, feel free to jump in with them. So, is there a question? Who doesn't see? Who doesn't see? Food. Butcher. We got a butcher right there. Butcher is important. Yes. Sure. So bloodletting during at the time that the Talmud was fully redacted was around 600 CE, and at that time bloodletting was a form of, it's what a physician did. It was seen as a way of healing the body from illness. So again, we no longer see bloodletters as being the go-to when you have a fever, but at this time, that was the mechanism for healing the sick. And so you can see here again, caring for one's body, caring for the well-being. That tzedakah fund meant that no one went hungry. In Jewish communities, there was a heavy ethic of providing for those who were less, who weren't able to provide for themselves. So you had a very, I think this is a good text that sort of exemplifies the values that went into building Jewish communities. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Now, kashrut is really has its origins in Torah itself. Yes. Doctrine and the bloodletter of what. My understanding is that they were that a healer of the body, whether it be would do bloodletting. So there were physicians who did bloodletting at that time. Yes. Tzedakah? Tzedakah is charity. So a tzedakah, the word tzedakah literally means justice. And in Judaism, giving to those who are vulnerable is a primary value, and therefore is aligned with justice. To be a just person, you must give to help in the well-being of others. What? Oh, the question was, what was tzedakah?
And I said, how is it? That's how beat it.
Right. And this was to make sure that there was no hanky-panky with the funds. It was a way of ensuring that not only that these funds were kept pristine and given to who was requiring of them. Okay, so we're going to jump into feudal Europe. This is the Middle Ages, and we've got lots of these little communities that are built on these values throughout Muslim Spain and Christian Europe, different parts of Christian Europe. The early medieval period was actually pretty prosperous for Jews. Over here, you'll see this is kind of a hierarchy within the feudal system. You got peasants all the way down here who do all the work, and everybody's got a place within the feudal system, except Jews. Jews are outside of it. They are not a part of this system. Let's see, I think this will be helpful. So Jews were relatively free and moderately prosperous. In fact, we've got three rulers, one pope and actually four rulers, who all invited Jews into their lands during this time. And the reason they invited Jews into these lands is because Jews could do something that Christians couldn't. Christians were not allowed to lend money, to collect interest for money, which meant that Christians weren't money lenders. Well, anybody has ever interfaced with business of any sort, money lending is a vital part of making any economy work. So since Jews were outside the caste system, it was a natural area where they could step in and prosper. So they were outside of the feudal system. They weren't tied to the land as peasants or to a craft guild. So within the Middle Ages, you were indentured. Most people were indentured either to the land, in which they worked the land for an overlord of some sort, or they were indentured to a craft guild where they were could only work within that framework. Jews weren't either of those. So Jews became money lenders and financiers. Any questions about that? Okay. So while it was reasonably okay in the early medieval period for Jews, whether in Muslim or Christian countries, they fared much better generally under Muslims. So Jews were widely tolerated and often invited by Muslim overlords. In fact, when Ferdinand and Isabella expelled the Jews from Spain, the Caliph in what was now Istanbul but was then Constantinople invite all the Jews in and he actually says, everybody says that Ferdinand is a wise king, except he's sent away, he has stripped his community or his land of riches by expelling the Jews, and I get all of those riches by bringing them into my country. So there was this sense of Jews providing a benefit where they were. Under Muslim rule, Jews and Christians were granted exemption from the military, right to their own court of law, and the guarantee of safety of their property. This one here is a big one because in Christian countries, that was not the case. Jews were often subject to sort of random marauding, and nobody got in trouble for it. But under Muslim rule, it was very clear that if you took action against Jewish communities, you were going to suffer for it. So this freedom, sort of like freedom to breathe, you could just be, which I think about a lot these days since so many folks are not given space to be. The freedom to be allowed for incredible innovations. Okay, so during this period in Spain, there was incredible innovation in poetry. The Jews had just these beautiful poetic compositions in Arabic, usually. Science and philosophy, these were all areas where Jews really innovated during this time. And I believe that the reason we see so much innovation in this time and place that was not happening in the Christian parts of Europe, happening with Jews under Christian rule, is because they didn't have that same sense of safety. Just so y'all know, my first incarnation was as a developmental specialist, and I tend to look at the world through that focus of development. And, Jews of Spain had the freedom to develop in a sort of natural, innovative way, where Jews under Christian rule didn't, because life was more precarious and less safe. Yes. Because Spain was Muslim at the time. So in sometime around, I'm not sure the date entirely, but in the very late 1400s, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella reclaimed Spain as a Catholic country, and then life gets very unpleasant for Jews. So in the middle to late Middle Ages, things really kind of go off the rails a little bit. This is not a pleasant time in history. And for the Jews, we've got crusades, disputations, and expulsions. Oh my, just there's a lot going on. Thinking lions and tigers and bears. Oh my, that's where my head is. So I wanted to give you, the crusades were designed to free the Holy Land, which is Jerusalem, and to turn it into a Christian shrine. So that was the objective of the crusades, to get Jerusalem out of Muslim control, which it was at the time, claim it for Catholicism, and turn it into a Christian shrine. All kinds of heretics, and what constituted a heretic was anyone who wasn't Catholic. Jews, Muslims, scientists, and suspect Christians became the enemy. Not only the enemy within Europe, but they became the enemy of God. That is how they were seen. This suspect Christians has to do with Jewish converts to Christianity. And there were Jewish converts to Christianity because converting to Christianity made life a lot easier for a Jew than it was as a Jew. But a lot of folks converted, kind of, sort of, would continue to practice Judaism in secret. And they were considered the supreme heretics, and they were the ones who were subject to the Inquisition, which was happening around the same time. The Inquisition, if you were found to be guilty, which is pretty much if anyone accused you of being a suspect Christian, typically you were either flayed alive or burned at the stake. Again, not an awesome time and place for Jews. The Crusades were responsible for just massacring tens of thousands of Jews, and not just Jews. again, anyone who challenged the supremacy of Catholicism were deemed the enemy of God. So that could include scientists, anyone who was challenging the Catholic formulation of how the world came into being or how the world works. Things like if the earth revolves around the sun instead of vice versa, if you were making those kinds of claims as a scientist, you were in the same kind of hot water. Yeah. So that doesn't happen until the Reformation, which is Martin Luther would be 1600 somewhere. Not an area of expertise for me, but not really.
Is there a structure to the?
Yes. Popes have tremendous power, tremendous political power at this point. Okay, so we had the Crusades, not an enjoyable thing. We also had disputations. So disputations were when Jews were commanded to defend their religion. And usually what would happen is priests would debate a very knowledgeable Jew, and a very knowledgeable priest would debate and try to prove that Christianity was the true religion and that Jesus was the true Messiah. So these were never good. They were never good for Jews because there was no way to win. They were, if there was, if a disputation, if someone who was defending Judaism did it a little too aggressively or was a little too empowered, their life was often in terrible danger. So the most famous disputation, I'm just bringing one in, there were several during this period, but the most famous was in Barcelona for 4 days, July 20 through 24 in 1263. And this came by the order of James I of Aragon. And James was a pretty progressive king. He didn't really want to go this direction with the disputations, but was getting a lot of pressure from the Pope and from the cardinals, and so he felt that he had to command this. So this disputation was to be held in the presence of the king, his court, and many dignitaries and knights. Now think about this. You're a kind of degraded people to begin with. You're walking on the knife's edge from day to day, and you have to walk into a forum with hundreds and hundreds of people, including the king, and lots of knights with swords at their sides, and you have to give your best attempt at defending your religion. Not an easy experience. But disputations were also one way in which Jews maintained their identity, because through them, even though they were terribly, terribly difficult for the people who were actually commanded to engage in the debate itself, the process of defending your religion and standing up against those odds was in its own way very empowering for the people at large. This disputation in Barcelona was between a Jewish convert. Usually they were the most aggressive. He was Friar Pablo Cristiani. And on the Jewish side was Nachmanides. Now, Nachmanides was a big deal. He was the leading scholar, physician, leader generally. He was a biblical commentator. He was a profound Kabbalist. He was basically everything you would want in a rabbi leader, right? He was brilliant, and he decimated Christianity in the disputation. So much I want to make sure. So the question that they debated was whether or not Jesus was Messiah, whether the Messiah was divine or human, and whether Jews or Christians held the true faith. And what Christianity promised James that he could do is he promised that he could prove using Jewish texts, using the Talmud, that Jews, they knew that Jesus was Messiah. That was what he conveyed to James. He did not succeed very well. At the end of the disputation, James awards Nachmanides 300 gold pieces and declares that never before had an unjust cause been so nobly defended. So, it's kind of a backwards compliment or a backwards insult, but it's clear to everybody in the forum that Nachmanides absolutely decimates Christianity's arguments, which puts Nachmanides in a difficult place. So the Dominican, this was the I'm not sure the word in Catholicism. It was like the sect of Catholicism claimed victory. So Nachmanides knew he had won, and he was not going to just roll over to this propaganda. So he published the verbatim transcript of the entire proceedings and just pissed everybody off. He just there was no way to defend at the Catholics couldn't defend at that point, and they were very angry. So the church responds to this so badly that James basically says, you need to leave Spain now. And within 3 days, he has left. And then James goes on in another concession to the priests. He goes on to order that every statement that is deemed offensive within the Talmud be removed. And just to be clear, there are references to Jesus in the Talmud. They are not very positive leaning. Let's just put that. So there's a midrash in the Talmud of Jesus being boiled in excrement upon his death for his sins. And you have to understand, for the Jews, Jesus is the ultimate heretic. He has brought death and destruction upon Jews because the Christians do not want Judaism to exist once it comes into being. So it's a very complicated thing, and they're not very nice about Jesus in the Talmud, and that's made everybody angry, and so Nachmanides has to flee. So we've got crusades, disputations, and then we have what is, without question, the most traumatic event. In fact, the most traumatic event of this period of Jewish history. Yes.
But how do you go about tearing up?
So at this point, the printing press isn't up and running at this point. So all Talmud texts, all texts, Bible, Talmud, anything, is written by hand, by scribes. And so it's a matter of rewriting the pages and omitting I'm not sure that they could, but it's, but when your life depends on it, you will work pretty hard to make it happen. So a lot of those texts were lost for hundreds and hundreds of years. They have been reclaimed. Some of them have been reintegrated into Talmudic texts. It's controversial. It's given this history, it's a scary thing to be be making the Talmud whole again with these texts, because they caused so much pain and suffering at the time. Okay, so the Spanish expulsion. So what happened is Jews were living their golden life in Spain for about 500 years, where they were innovating and creating. And then Ferdinand and Isabella, I'm abbreviating this history here, reclaim Spain. And within a very short period, Jews are given 3 months to either convert to Catholicism or to leave. And about a third of Spanish Jews were murdered during this process. There were a lot of claims that, for instance, there was one in sort of like the early version of social media, right? There were rumors started that Jews were actually swallowing jewels and trying to hoard jewels. So many Jews were sliced open as they were trying to get on to the ships to leave. So about a third were murdered, about half left Spain, and the rest converted. And this was the only thing that I can relate this to or compare it to is the experience of Jews in the 50s and 60s of post the Holocaust. That sense of utter devastation is what the Jews of the world experienced at this time. That a people who had been invited and had lived and thrived in a country were suddenly, and very suddenly, they were given 3 months to leave. It put Jews across the world in a state of feeling unease and lack of safety. So, terrible thing. But one of the ways that Jews maintained identity, because something like the expulsion, there were Jews who went, I can't do this anymore, and they converted. And that's not an unreasonable response to that kind of trauma. But what the Jews of the time did, many of them, so in Spain prior to the expulsion, had been a place of incredible Kabbalistic innovation. So Kabbalah was at the time, which is Jewish mysticism, was an esoteric and very high level sort of thought exercise for big macher rabbis. And so it was this time of incredible innovation. And then they had to leave. Many of them ended up in the land of Israel, in the city of Sfat. And the mystics of Sfat developed in response to this profound trauma and profound disempowerment that came with the expulsion. They developed a theology that is incredibly empowered. So it's called Lurianic Kabbalah. So at least one person here is in the class I'm teaching on it right now. Lurianic Kabbalah takes this idea, takes the trauma of being degraded and says, wait, there is evil in the world because divinity has been broken. And I'm not going to go deep into Kabbalistic theology right here because that would be a whole nother semester. The Kabbalists of Sfat developed this theology that is basically based on the idea that God needs us as much as we need God, and that to heal divinity who was who was shattered in some respects during the creation story. And again, this is theology you're not going to know too much about. But in order to heal divinity and thereby heal the world, we Jews across the world have to engage in mitzvot. We have to engage in practices of intention, and we have to embody this theology. Includes making love with your beloved, and there are many aspects of Lurianic Kabbalistic theology. But the bottom line that's so important is it took a situation of utter disempowerment and innovated and turned it on its head. And what I'm suggesting to you here is that response is why Jews exist today. That response is how we kept identity, by responding to trauma with innovation within Judaism itself. And that's the key part of how Jews have kept their identity across time. And okay, so we're going to go through modernity quickly here. So with modernity, so let me wrap up on this. Any questions about the medieval Jewish experience at this point?
The disputation.
Pretty much. It was the imagery that comes to my mind is kind of like when my cat plays with a bug. You know, that sense of my cat feels incredibly empowered and has a lot of fun playing with that bug until it dies. That's kind of the power differential that was going on between Jews and Catholics at that point. Any other question? Okay. So by the Middle Ages, most Jews were living outside the land. I think I said this. All right. So we enter the modern period with the Enlightenment. And this is probably the most important period of time within any religious history, because it changes, the Enlightenment changes everything. Specifically, and most importantly, the Enlightenment, the advent of the Enlightenment changed how Jews, Catholics, Christians, Muslims, how everyone saw truth. Up until the Enlightenment, truth was determined by one's religion. You were Catholic, you had a certain set of truths. You were Jewish, you had a certain set of truths. With the advent of the Enlightenment, what is now seen as the definer of truth is science. We moved into a period where religion starts losing some of its iron grip on people's lives generally, and science is seen as sort of the solution to everything. This becomes very problematic, which we'll get to in a sec. For the first, and during the Enlightenment, for the first time, Jews are allowed out of their ghettos and into modern society. So this creates a lot of tension, right? That up until the Enlightenment, Jews and Christians, Jews and Muslims have been in their separate little bubbles. But with the Enlightenment, there's this intermixing, which creates some tensions, not just between groups, but within Jews as a group as well. Because now we're presented with a whole list of new problems. How do we fit into greater society? What needs to change about us? How far can we change? Should Judaism change to accommodate this modern world? I mean, these were questions that bring a lot of tension. And So the question is, how did Jews maintain identity in early modernity? Some didn't. Some took conversion to a very sort of jaded approach to conversion. There were a lot of conversion to Christianity was seen as a ticket to high society, right? While you might be allowed as a Jew to integrate with the greater society, you weren't really deemed a high roller within Christian European society as a Jew. So some simply chose to abdicate their Jewish identity. One of the ways that Jewish identity was retained in response to the Enlightenment was the rise of denominations within Judaism. So Reform Judaism, like it or hate it, I consider myself, I was ordained in the Reform movement, though I consider myself a post-denominational rabbi. Reform Judaism served an incredibly important purpose in that it helped to modernize Judaism across the board. So with the exception of ultra-Orthodoxy, every aspect of Jewish tradition, whether it's Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, Modern, Orthodox, is more modern today as a result of the kick in the pants that Reform Judaism gave Judaism as a whole. So there was some see the Reform movement as it began as being really kind of out there, really kind of ultra progressive, or that I'm not thinking of the derogatory word that would come to mind. But without Reform Judaism, we would not have conservative Judaism. We would not have the many ways that Jews are able to maintain a Jewish identity and live in the modern world today. Because Judaism prior to this time period was not in line with modernity. It was still had all of the trappings of a very ancient religion, continues to be an ancient religion, but with the Reform movement, what happens is sort of a window dressing that allows greater access. For instance, synagogues start having organs. The reason synagogues have organs, any that do, is because they wanted to be more consistent with their Lutheran neighbors. Their rabbis started wearing robes, something I just hate. But those robe trappings were to emulate their Christian neighbors, to have a sense that we didn't look different, didn't act different, didn't seem different. We just worshiped differently. And so without Reform Judaism, the ability for the number of Jews to maintain that sense of Jewish identity across history would have been greatly diminished, because at this time Jews were presented with an alluring invitation into the greater society that they could have access to, but they couldn't have access to it easily if they wore payas and a big beard and big fur hat and on Shabbat. Like, that would not have allowed access into the greater society. So this time period created an absolute need for some sort of innovation in order to remain Jewish and still access society as a whole. And Reform Judaism was a big part of making that happen. So the biggest challenge that in modernity for Jews was the Shoah, the Holocaust. Shoah, or it literally means catastrophe, is the Jewish term for the Holocaust. A third of the world's Jewry was murdered during this period. Now think about that. 18 million people who were Jewish in the world, and it was cut by a third. That means that we as a people are much smaller today than we would have been if those millions of Jews had reached maturity, had children and grandchildren. There aren't really words for the level of demoralization that this catastrophe brought. And you know, the Nazis were not unique for their level of inhumanity. They were just unique for their level of inhumanity in the modern era. So the Romans were all about doing atrocious things. But that's in the ancient distant past, right? And this was the first time that we had this kind of absolute degradation of a people in the modern period. And the only thing that it can be compared to in history is the experience of the Jews after the expulsion from Spain. And then Portugal, there are more expulsions that happen along the way. I'm just giving highlights here. And then finally, the Jewish responses to the Shoah. Remember, we're on this, how do we maintain identity? So a lot of innovation in theology happened in the 60s and 70s in response to this horrific experience. There was a rise of what it's called today a new Hasidim, which is Hasidic theology that has a more modern spin to it. So it's actually my favorite theological bent in Judaism. But it's a very innovative approach. This was normally limited only to ultra-Orthodox folks, Hasidic communities, but there were innovations to this theology to make it more available across denominations. There was an incredible increase in focus on tikkun olam, which is repairing the world. That makes sense, right? If you have experienced the world as being a very broken place, then focusing on repairing it makes sense. And Jews who had Zionistic desires for 150 years by this time, it takes a new intensity. This need for a homeland becomes once again the most important thing after the Shoah. And that brings us to the creation of the State of Israel. So on May 14th, and let me just a caveat here. There are folks who will tell you that the creation of the State of Israel had nothing to do with the Shoah, had nothing to do with the Holocaust, because there were Zionistic aspirations for quite a while before. And that is true, but it's also true that it wouldn't have happened without the Holocaust, that it required the world to be shamed in order to make Israel come into being. So immediately, on May 14th, 1948, Ben Gurion and his dignitaries declare Israel independence, and the State of Israel is created. Within an hour, Truman? Must have been Truman. The president of this country, within an hour, contacts Ben Gurion to congratulate them on the state coming into being. The Soviets contact them very quickly thereafter. So there's support. There's also all of the surrounding Arab powers immediately declare war and advance troops against Israel forces. It's called the War of Independence. It lasts for quite a while. When ceasefires, not peace, when ceasefires are agreed on with the Arab nations in 1949. And over the next 4 years, Arab nations expel most of the Jewish population within them, some populations that have been there for 1,000 years. Most of them end up in Israel. That's, again, how Jews maintain identity was ultimately a return to a homeland. So I am out of time, and I'm also out of slides. So I would welcome any questions, comments, thoughts.
If the worldwide view.
That's a very interesting conversation or question. Oh, the question is, thank you. The question is, what percentage of Jews were in Spain at the time of the expulsion? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. It's a great question. A very sizable, what I can tell you is more likely more than half were there at the time, in that this was the epicenter of Jewish freedom at the time. So it had a big drop, but I don't know the exact number. Any other questions? Okay. So the next class is actually one of my favorite things in the world to teach, which is the evolution of Jewish theology, and it evolves within the Hebrew Bible itself. So it's a lot of offshoots within Jewish theology, and I look forward to sharing it with y'all. I want to say I can tell you.
April 18th. At the night of Tuesday night.
What was that?
It's 18. The third one is next.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi.
Good. Okay. Thank you all very much. I pleasure.